everybody, and welcome. This is Joe Nugent here, and I'm coming from Boston College. Well, actually, I'm coming from Boston College, Ireland, and it's very nice to see you, though I don't quite see you. We're here to celebrate the launch of a pretty important book, and it is, of course, The Child Sex Scandal and Modern Irish Literature, co-authored by Margot, Gayle, Backus, and by Joseph Valente. I'm just going to say something about the book, and this is the blurb, but why not take this, indeed, that what it tells you is that through close critical readings of scandal narratives by 9 major modern Irish authors, the authors suggest how Ireland's post-colonial heritage served to enable the abuse that I'm afraid that we're reading about so much in the newspaper at the moment. The child sex scandal in modern Irish literature refines the debates on why so many Irish children were lost by offering insight into the lived experience of both the children and of those who failed them. And I'm going to tell you just a little about our 2 speakers. Joseph Valente is, of course, the Distinguished Professor of English and Disability Studies at the University of Buffalo. He's Treasurer of the International Yeats Society. He's authored The Myth of Manliness in Irish Nationalist Culture, 1880 to 1922, published in 2011. Dracula's Crypt, Bram Stoker, Irishness and the Question of Blood, University of Illinois Press, 2012, and James Joyce and the Problem of Justice, Negotiating Sexual and Colonial Difference, Cambridge Press, 2009. His edited collections and journal articles are simply too numerous for me to mention. He's a very great friend of Boston College, and I'm so very, very happy to be here in his company. Margot Gayle Backus is Professor of Literature at the University of Houston, noted Irish scholar and prominent Joycean. She completed her 2nd book, Scandal Work, James Joyce, The New Journalism and the Home Rule Newspaper Wars, in 2013. Her prize-winning book, The Gothic Family Romance, Heterosexuality and Child Sacrifice in the Anglo-Irish Colonial Order, came out from Duke University Press in 1999. And Margot, too, has multitudes of journal articles to her name. The responder today, most of you will know, but I'm going to tell you that Kate Costello-Sullivan, of course, is a professor of modern Irish literature and the former dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at LeMoyne College. She's the author of Mother Country, Politics of the Personal in the Fiction of Colm Tóibín, and the editor of critical editions of J. Sheridan Le Fanu's novel Carmilla with Syracuse University Press, and Nora House, Poor Women with Anthem Press. Her most recent monograph, Trauma and Recovery in the 21st Century Irish Novel, was published by Syracuse University Press in 2018. Kate, of course, is the current president of the American Conference of Irish Studies, and indeed, on top of that, she is one of the most admired alumni of Boston College, who completed her doctorate here. I'm not quite sure when, Kate, a little before my time, but not much before my time. So I'm going to pass it over to Kate Costello-Sullivan here, and she will take it from there. So Kate, away you go. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks for the invitation to join the conversation today. We really do intend to treat this as a conversation, so I'm going to try to volley this back and forth between Joe and Margot. We've also kind of agreed ahead of time to have and allow those normal debates that one has, which means we might occasionally talk over each other should things get enthusiastically exciting. But I see my role here predominantly as trying to shepherd us through the points that we'd like to get to today. And that means that we'd like to touch on a number of the parts of the book, for those of you who might not have seen it. We'd like to talk a little bit about the intro, about the Land of Spices chapter, the Country Girls chapter, and the Gathering chapter. So we'll try to be sure that we're careful stewards of time, and that we also leave, of course, time for your welcome questions at the end. And don't forget, you can, of course, put questions into the chat if you'd like, and we will try to keep an eye for those as well. So I do want to say how completely delighted I am to be here, not only because of my friendship with Joe and Margot respectively, and my love for Boston College, of course, but also because I agree with Joe that this is a really, really important book that I'm very enthusiastic about. In fact, I've already cited it in an article that I'm working on. So what higher praise do any of us have? So part of what's impressive here, and these are some of the points that I think we're going to try to come back to in our discussion. One is the intervention that it makes into some really well-known classic texts, some new classics and some older classics. The second is the conversation that it has around the sex abuse scandal and the history of it in Ireland, which is obviously such a current important topic. And then the last, I think, is just the way it's written. And the fluidity with which it moves back and forth between really impressive, close readings to some pretty precise but expansive theoretical engagements with psychoanalytic theory. So I just wanted to congratulate you again personally on this text and say how much I'm looking forward to the conversation. So to it, my first question is about that element of the balance that this text strikes and the way that it has this dual valence of being, on the one hand, a history of a specific kind of literary representation, what you guys call the scandal through the eyes of innocence. And at the same time, it's also a history of the sex scandal itself in Ireland and traces both of those paths throughout the text. So my first question, which I'll direct to both of you, but I'll start with Margot, is just tell me a little bit about how this book evolved in following that dual pathway.
Sure, and that's something that I am continually finding out more about, so I really like getting to talk about this. And this time around, I appreciated Joe Nugent, emphasizing the sacrifice of children, because I'm like, yes, I really have been thinking about this a long time. And the one critique that was made of that first book, which I'm very still fond of, but that I did accept, is essentially that, its mode of allegorical analysis is sort of unidirectional. It really is sort of about what happens materially and sociologically and psychoanalytically, and then that lodges itself in the text so that the text becomes a way of, finding out things about the larger social order. And what happened here is I got interested in scandal. And I think one of the ways I got interested in sex scandal, one reason I got in, well, it's a whole other story. Declan Khyber told me when I very first arrived in Ireland in '89 and said, how do I study homosexuality? I want to, because in '89, that was the language I had. I want to study homosexuality in Ireland. And Declan didn't know exactly what to do, although everybody wanted me to, there were a few authors that everybody thought I should personally meet, but nobody had any, nobody knew of any scholarship. But he said, you should go to Northern Ireland and study the Kincora scandal. That is an interesting thing. And so it was sort of like I was handed scandal right off as a kind of category of analysis. And being a good student and considering Declan to be a kind of adoptive mentor, as he is to so many of us, I felt that was something I had committed to do. And so I did ultimately go and look at Kincora. And in looking at Kincora and trying to draw to work with it, which was very difficult, which is one of the things I've learned about sex scandal, is that it demolishes your ability to speak reasonably. And if you try to speak reasonably, you feel like you're kind of advocating for, whatever is being scandalized or apologizing for it. And if you try to slow it down, pick it apart, work on, what are all the different stakes, it all feels just awful. But anyway, I started reading up on other people's stuff on scandal, and I read this really cool article in a communications journal that was titled Pollution, Nazis, and No Sex. And it was about German scandal culture and the fact that Germans are not scandalized by sex. They do not do sex scandal. What they are scandalized by is, turning out that leaders pollute, that they have investments in industries that pollute, or they have gone easy on polluters who have given money to them, or that they have ties to the Nazi party. Wouldn't that be lovely? I vote that we go for that. I like that scandal culture. But anyway, so the idea of scandal culture became really important. And what scandal culture then made possible is for me to think, how does the literary or the representational then also push? So when I started working with Joe, we didn't know we were working on any of these issues. We thought we were working primarily on what we were then calling sexual initiation, kind of where do kids get their very first, you know, information. And we thought it would be, and it was very interesting to look at the sisters and a portrait at Joyce's early representations that are very detailed about very young children who are getting their very first, who are making sense of this. So that's where we started, and it then converged into these interests that on my part have been, you know, about harmed children and the intersections or the dynamics that go back and forth between representation and materiality, but in a way that allows for, I think, a much more dialectical representation of that.
So for you, it was partly that scandal focus, and then the way the historicizing of it influenced, and your interest in materiality and the literary. And Joe, how about you? What is your, you know, arrival at this?
I was interested in abuse. I mean, that was my interest. My interest was in what gave rise to the scandal rather than the scandal. My primary interest was in the sex abuse, and my interest in our early work. I mean, the first thing we wrote was on Joyce. The second thing we wrote was on Joyce. And in both instances, I was interested in the way sexual initiation in Joyce ran very, very close, ran in tandem with sexual abuse. And that at that point, I became really interested in the question that drove me in the project was, what is specific about a literary response to child sex abuse, and as Margot was bringing in all of the scandal culture stuff, to scandal culture, or what in a scandal culture is the particular place that literature occupies as a kind of critique of the culture and a critique of the abuse. And so that's really, I think I said this before to you, Kate, but I think that the way in which this dual track unfolded was that we had these two interests. We both were interested in both, but Margot's interest was more in the scandal than in the abuse. Mine was more on the abuse than the scandal. And dialectically, we continually work through that uneven distribution of investment. In fact, we wrote a blog, and this was after the book was done and after the book was published, and Indiana Press wants us to do a press blog, and we do a press blog, you know, like 2,000 words, and basically we're still working through that. I noticed in that press blog, we're still working through what should the proportionality here be, right? So that's, I think that actually is a real important point of creative tension between us, because we don't actually agree entirely on that proportionality, or we wouldn't have to negotiate it. But at the same time, it kind of forces us, you know, dialectically to produce something that answers both of these interests and therefore moves at another level.
Well, and I think that's part of what's so impressive about the way you marry these things is you do really move seamlessly between the two throughout the text. I mean, it's actually quite remarkable. And we'll talk about this a little more when we get to the Land of Spices. When you were talking about those historical contexts, it made me think of one of my favorite sort of early moments in the text, in the introduction, when basically you talked about the church and how the performance of care evacuated actual responsibility. And I thought that was a really powerful way to put that comment. And it's also where you referred to the church unsaving or counter-saving children, which is one of those like LOL sob kind of moments. On the one hand, it's a very funny construction. On the other hand, there's nothing funny about it at all. But that does lead me to a second question, which is that I think something that all of us share in our work is that interest in the mediating role of authors, and how, you know, writing is not a static or an insulated undertaking, and that it has both the influence of society on it and the catalytic potential, or perhaps not even catalytic, the energized potentiality to intervene, right, in societal issues. And in fact, there's a grad student at BC right now, Megan Crotty, whose dissertation is very much in conversation with these questions of you know, the way literature can impact social contexts and milieus and trauma and such. So one thing I think that this text does, and I've said this to both of you before, is I think that it provides, through the psychoanalytic framework, some language for survivors to cope with or reframe some things that are really actually quite difficult. So for example, you talk in the introduction about how child sex abuse provides what you call a simulation of agency over which the victim has no control, and how the abuser, and I'm quoting, orchestrates in order to compel, turning juvenile desire against itself, right? Psychically incriminating the victim in an action that the predator alone commits. So I think that's really a potentially very healing, empowering use of psychoanalytic theory. It's a very practical use of psychoanalytic theory, with no disrespect to psychoanalytic theory. I just mean it's a lucidly direct, impactful use that you bring to bear here, because as you know, so many trauma victims struggle with issues of the body and questions of control. And so, Joe, do you want to speak a little bit to that use of the enigmatic signifier and the way psychoanalytic theory undergirds the text? Sorry, that was a long question, but it was a...
No, it was, I can't tell you how dear to my heart that question was, because there was a moment when the moment we came up with the idea that really the truly nefarious aspect of child sexual abuse is not what it does to bodies, but what it does to desiring apparatuses, how it interferes with the desiring mechanism. That was actually the moment I said to myself, this is important stuff. now I'm sure. And the enigmatic signifier seems to me to be crucial in this. If we understand the enigmatic signifier as that moment at which we all become subjects because we all become sexualized, and that sexualization comes from unconscious messages from our upbringing figures, our parental figures, that we can't process, but that we respond to within our own fantasy frames, then what we see is that our moment of sexualization and our moment of coming to be subjects is a moment in which we are located in liminal space between what happens to us and what we do, right? It's that moment of sexualization is the moment at which we are in this equivocal zone between being acted on and receiving action in such a way that it is our own action, between the exogenous and the endogenous. And it seems to me that what child sexual abuse, and I'll go further, I say sexual abuse generally because that moment of sexualization is always available to be reactivated. And it's always available to be reactivated in many ways, including abuse, and that abuse can occur later in life. So it's not just child sexual abuse, but all sexual abuse poaches on that original moment of being in between, of being in this liminal zone, and turns the action back upon the victim, okay? And so instead of equivocality, you have the victim's own doubts, right? You have the victim's own, am I a part of this? Am I responsible for this? And it's something that rape culture reinforces, absolutely. But what I would say is, it has something to reinforce. That is that the kernel is already there in our sexualization. And that's what the child sexual abuser poaches on, and it's what the rape culture reinforces, right? The idea that your desire is implicated in what is happening to you, right? That your desire can be manipulated against your will, that there is an actual split there between your desiring mechanism and your willing mechanism. And that's a split that you can't fully cognize in the moment or perhaps thereafter, right? And an awful lot of what goes on in terms of what we might call the trauma effect of child sexual abuse, where the original trauma gets repeated in various ways, is a repetition involved in the subject trying to disentangle what happened to them from what they were party to.
And so part of what's so interesting about that is, by first of all, that basically you're suggesting, if I I'm understanding you correctly and from the book, that child sexual abuse, basically, it's a warping or a disturbing of the victim's entry into the symbolic order, which is going to have implications throughout. Not just in agential ways, but in representational ways. And I think we can come back to that in The Gathering. But I did want to say that that's particularly interesting to me to hear you talk about it in that abstract, well, concrete, but abstract way, because I know Margot and I share an interest in the book by Bessel van der Kolk about the body keeps the score. And so again, that's such an important wedding of the bodily and the psychic in ways that I think are profoundly meaningful for survivors. So thank you for that answer.
Jacques Lacan once said, when you cut your thumb when you're slicing a tomato, it's because you don't remember what happened to you, but your thumb remembered, right? That idea that what you're working out or what you can't work out is encoded in your somatic reality.
Yeah, so that might be a good way to segue to The Land of Spices, because I think part of the richness of this framework that you're articulating so well is that, as I said in the beginning, it lent itself to some really new readings of these texts that so many people love. I mean, I would call them interventions into the ways that we engage these texts. And we talked a little bit about the dual pathways that you followed here. And I think in the case of The Land of Spices, you do that partly through that Oedipal pathway that Joe, you just referred to, and partly through the historicizing of what you guys called an open secret in society that changes to a taboo, right? And so this is one of those places where it's not just a question of the history of representation, though you also bring in reception theory, which I found so interesting. And you talked about the residual rules of open secrecy and how it stifles critical commentary on queer, non-normative readings of the text. And so I thought, maybe I'll give that to you, Margot, and just say, do you want to speak to that a bit?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to. I worked and gave a lot of thought to, what I perceive as a kind of, shift in gravity. And the work that Joe and I were doing really predominantly addressed itself to an Ireland in which the shift to a kind of literate modernity had already, fully taken place, with the church in many ways presiding over the terms upon which that literacy was taken up, and the sort of, holding of the of power over the terms of, the circulation of ideas and representation through literary circuitry being very much already sort of harnessed to national interests, with with certain incredibly interesting alternatives like the Advanced Nationalist Press, and especially the wonderful work that James Connolly was doing in 1913, when at Liberty Hall he was running like the one anti-war press in all of Europe during World War I. So there's lovely stories to be told about this kind of counter literacy. But I was really fixated on Angela Burke's The Burning of Bridget Cleary, and her, because she makes so clear, right, that there's this sort of threshold even within this one family that she's looking at, where the older siblings are part of, an older orally based culture that is not yet, sort of, brought into this sort of broader cash nexus that would be really an imperial, was coming out of England. It wasn't, Ireland kind of was both the second city of the British Empire, but also, the first city of, Ireland, which was a British colony. And so, there's this unstable both and to all of that. but really, especially when it came to economic arrangements and you know, and the influence of the British press, the, you know, the sort of literate modernity in Ireland was very, very swayed and shaped by British colonialism, and then by the church, and by various devil's bargains made between the two. Whereas the oral culture was shaped by, you know, centuries prior of colonization, and the ability of people to kind of have each other's backs and hold each other's secrets, and community is being very much identified by a sort of shared epistemology that did not, you know, that you had no responsibility to move beyond that. So yeah, and I guess I'll just really say one more thing. It's clear to me that in Land of Spices, that older epistemology is still happening, and it was so important to me and so moving to me to be able to include one textual look at a world prior to, you know, this kind of Jansenist, you know, kind of nationalism that was very much already, you know, beholden to and accommodating. It has made its accommodations with the imperial order that isn't going to actually in any way, you know, it may be at times in competition with, you know, the British Empire, but we see what happens, you know, in World War I, you know, like most of the nationalists immediately can't wait to go fight with the British Empire. They love the British Empire. The Empire is their ally. You know, what kind of nationalism is that? I don't know, but it's the kind of nationalism that didn't exist in the, you know, in the convent school that O'Brien is depicting, where, you know, you just have this prior oral culture that is local, and it's also, you know, transnational, but it's within a particular community.
So
And, yeah,
that, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
that's it. That's just the, and we see the kind of, you know, we see the juggernaut coming that's going to like wipe this all out from the face of Ireland. It's going to be gone. Or it's, I mean, no, I mean, there's still pockets of it, absolutely. And I will say, okay, when I first got to Ireland and was asking all these awkward questions as a social outsider, one of the first ones I always asked is like, well, tell me about Nell McCafferty, because I understand she's one of your top, you know, leading lesbians. And everybody was like, no. You know, people did not want to talk about that. And it took me a long time to appreciate how protective that gesture was. And that is the old oral culture. She is one of ours, and you're an American grad student. We have no idea what you're up to. We don't know what you're going to say or where you're going to say it. And we are certainly, it's not going to be through me that some idiot who doesn't know the rules is going to, you know, have information that belongs to our people.
Well, so
and
it goes back to what you talked about with scandal, though, right? Mm-hmm. It goes back to your scandal work, because in the chapter you said that the rise of the public scandal culture in Ireland did consolidate socially forbidden or disavowed sexual desires, sensations, and practices. So I can see definitely how those two things connect. So thank you for that. And that also actually brings me back, Joe, that I'm going to bump back to you, because it also invokes that question of, and I think you do this brilliantly in this chapter, the way both of you move back and forth between the characters' conscious and unconscious associations and how those are in play. So in case, for people who haven't read this yet, Joe, do you want to talk a little bit about the trauma a little bit more? It's a follow-up to what you said before, but I think it connects to what Margot is saying. The trauma inherent in jouissance.
Yeah, a couple of things. One is the enigmatic signifier emerges in Land of Spices precisely along the border between the oral and the literate culture. I mean, the word Shwamarai, which is our main enigmatic signifier, is contested between two branches within the order, right? One branch, Mother Mary Andrew, who identifies strongly with the sort of literate modernity Jansenist model of Catholicism, and the other, Mother Eugenia, who identifies with this older oral culture of open secret. And Mother Superior is between the two of them, and Mother Superior is on that line between the two of them, in part because she's experienced this trauma, right? Which, and I just want to say that there, in almost every narrative, there's some work done by the author. In this case, Kate O'Brien. Then again, Anne Enright, also Keith Ridgway, scrambling timelines. And in this, because the enigmatic signifier always, as I like to say, the enigmatic signifier always rings twice. You really don't get it the first time. It's a retroactive force seized upon at a moment of subsequent trauma. And the way the novel works this is that it provides beautiful forebodings. You don't know what exactly has traumatized this sister. What you do know is that whatever has traumatized her has put her in a very strange position vis-a-vis this enigmatic signifier that divides oral and literate culture. And so one of the beautiful things about Land of Spices, it seems to me, is the way in which the novel, completely implicates a larger socio-cultural, a cultural kampf, if you will, a larger social cultural fight or debate, and sees the parties to that debate as motivated by extremely intimate, extremely personal events or traumas in their own life. And the conclusion, which I think what I like best about the novel, and I say this as a believer, what I like best about the novel is the way in which O'Brien manages to suggest that the enigmatic signifier of the indefiniteness of sexuality puts it in some kind of inescapable communion with the indefinite sublimity of divine experience. And she by no means throws off the religious aspect of this order, and she ratifies it via negativa by insisting that the Mother Superior has to learn, right, about the sexual dimension of love in order to understand the divine dimension of love. And as a believer, that for me, that was incredibly important, and it's something that worked through the enigmatic signifier. So,
yeah, and it's another one of those examples, I think, of the ways that you guys negotiate both the textual representation and the historical context, because when you're talking about her reaction to the Schwärmerei, you said it's not just the dangers that they emanate, but it's also to protect Anna from the rise of a new puritanical Irish nationalism or Irish Catholicism, I forget which. So yeah, that's a great point. And I think it also goes to that question of the way the structure, the circularity of trauma and that sort of repetition compulsion, and the way that anything can trigger you right back to that moment. I do want to remind the audience that we're more than happy. I could sit here and throw questions at them all day, but I don't want to be selfish. So we do welcome the audience. Any questions that you might want to have, I promise I'll try to keep an eye, or Joe Nugent will be good enough to try to make sure we get them represented for you. So, oh, okay, Joe, did you just read?
No. I'm sorry. I'm playing with my Zoom thing here. Sorry. What does this do? What does that do? What does that do? Sorry.
Okay. So
raise your hand, Joe.
I know. I wanted to know what it did. Now I know what it did.
He's pitting his conscious and his unconscious against himself. So so let's talk then a little bit about the Country Girls. Let's move to that, because I think you consciously paired those texts in some really important ways, and obviously the use of the Oedipal is really neat. I have to admit, I talked to Margot and Joe right after that. I read that chapter, and I was basically bouncing up and down in my chair because I was very excited by this reading, partly because it accounts for some associations and relations that I'd always felt I needed to understand more, like Jack Holland and Hickey. And also because this is one of those chapters where I think your use, on the one hand, of a really masterful use of close literary readings pairs with really large, complicated theoretical frames that you make super accessible. And I'm thinking in particular in terms of the close readings, the homophonic moments of Dada and Baba, or you're breaking down the idea of tickling in the text. So Margot, do you want to talk a little bit about some of those readings in the text?
You know, I actually wanted to say when you were saying on Saturday how much you liked that chapter, I will just tell a quick story about the chapter, explains why Joe is the person to talk to about this. We have a whole other draft of a whole other chapter that is going to come out as something, you know, that will come out also, that's also very good. And we'd done a lot of work on that chapter, and it also had taken a long time to do work on that chapter because I got thrown into outright dissociation doing work on that chapter. I actually got, you know, completely re-triggered and was writing things that were bad writing. It was not fun. And, you know, we kind of got me back on track, and we had a game plan, and, you know, we did have, and a lot of the, you know, kind of Angela Burke, you know, sort of shift over from pre-modern to modern, and especially Caitlin as at the you know, it's sort of like Anna escapes, Anna gets out alive before the whole thing hits, and Caitlin and Baba are right on the fault line, and are, you know, of course, things do not go well for them. But anyway, so that is why Joe needs to answer these questions. I wanted to, and I also want to say, when Joe was talking about the theoretical, you know, psychoanalytic work that this book does, the one comment that I wanted to make, and I'll just make it now, is, aren't I smart to have worked with him? Like, wasn't that a good idea? I really, yeah, I was just feeling bursting with, like, I am so brilliant to have gotten to, like, you know, to have this model to hitch my insights to. It's been lovely. But in this particular case, more than any other, this chapter, what happened was, Joe, we'd been working so hard to be like, where is the enigmatic signifier? And I'd be like, I don't know. And we finally had an enigmatic signifier, but then Joe just like sat bolt upright and was like, no, this is how it works. And he just had a chapter, and it was beautiful. And so he should answer that question.
All right, well, I'll kick it over to him, although I will say I think you both made an excellent choice in your...
Yes, I was going to say back at you, Margot.
Yeah, but...
in my telegraphic way, mine does say back at you. Okay.
So Joe, let me reiterate then. So you guys talked a bit about in this chapter about the filial trauma engendering a subliminal erotic investment in its replication. And I think some of these moments, less the tickling, definitely the Dada Baba moment, are in conversation with that. So can you speak to how that close reading engages? And if you want to tie it into the wider theoretical framework, that's great too.
One of the things I thought that I found most interesting about The Country Girls is the way in which it married child sexual abuse within the family to a larger rape culture I was just blown away. You know, when you write about a book, you read it a bunch of times, right? I mean, at least I do. I mean, I don't get anything out of a novel on first read at all. Like, I'm just a babbling idiot. I mean, I only start to form complete sentences after a second reading. But to do writing on it, it takes like multiple readings. I'm reading this over and over again, and I'm thinking, this is like amazing how just... I think at one point I said, you know, it just seems like open season on pubescent females in this small town. It's just like, go for it, right? So the way in which the enigmatic signifier as child sexual abuse within an incestuous context mushrooms into a larger culture was one thing that was very interesting to me. And the other thing that was very interesting to me, and really goes to this problem of replication, is the way in which the text marries child sexual abuse and child physical abuse. And so it makes it clear that Kathleen's relationship to Dada is such that his physical abuse of her is always sexualized, right? And so the sexual abuse, the sexual transactions, the sexual repartee, and there is a little, is still relatively indefinite, relatively enigmatic, but it comes through, it's apprehensible in the way in which Dada himself figures the physical abuse. And so the problem of somehow disentangling these two tributaries of trauma is part of what drives Kathleen's replication of this trauma in every figure that she encounters. But the other thing I want to say, I think that's important about the reading is that, and different about the reading, is that people recognize the extent to which the gentleman communicates with Kathleen's father in her unconscious, right? Mm-hmm. And by the end of the novel, even in her consciousness, right? But it's important that all of these men do, and that Baba does as well. That is that what's important here is the assertion of authority and the assertion of aggression, because that's what ties the erotic component to the physical abuse. And that's why she responds. Baba, if you look at what Baba does to her, the way in which her father's abuse is both delinquency and cruelty. Both when he's there, he's hitting her, but he's often not there, and she's longing for him to be there. Baba just repeats that. She doesn't repeat it from the stance of, it's a male thing, but it's not. It doesn't necessarily have to inhabit a male body, right? Baba does exactly the same thing, right? She exiles her, says, go away, and makes her miserable that way. And then when she lets her back in, she makes her miserable by acts of overt cruelty, right? But it's trying to disentangle those two things. And what we used for that chapter was Ruth Lay's just brilliant, I think, account, and I would recommend it to anyone, Trauma, a Genealogy, in which she talks about mimetic versus anti-mimetic notions of the response to trauma. And those two things, she posits them as opposites, and they are, but in the novel, they don't have to be, because Kathleen can have an anti-mimetic, which is to say, fully conscious, I'm aware I'm being beaten, response to the physical abuse, and a mimetic, I'm unaware, therefore I repeat, response to the sexual abuse. And those two things throughout the novel are entangled with one another, so that she's forever pursuing her own misery in sexual terms, or pursuing her own jouissance in traumatic terms, right? She's either looking for the sexual payoff that will beat her, or she's looking for the beating that will erotically titillate her, right? And so I came up with a thing called traumasochism, right? And that's what she has. She's traumasochism. That's her condition.
Yeah. I mean, I thought the way that you traced it in all those different contexts was just so well done. And you did, in fact, call it an everyday atmosphere of open season on pubescent females. That was the expression.
I would say, though, that the tickling is directly a part of that, though, because the tickling, Baba's tickling of her has that double dimension, right? That she wants it and doesn't want it, because it's both tickle your fancy or tickle you till you can't breathe. It's both, right? A metaphor for pleasurable titillation and a metaphor for invasive bodily discomfort, right?
It's true. Yeah. And so that idea that she's sort of drawn to something that she can't necessarily even understand or recognize, I think is such an interesting part, especially of when you talk about the ending. When she goes to wait for Mr. Gentleman, but doesn't actually expect him to show up anyway.
Knows damn well he's not going to be there, and then says, I know he's not coming. So what does she do? She waits another hour or two.
Yeah.
Not because she thinks, oh, maybe on the off chance he'll come, just because this is actually part of, this is what I mean by what I mean by abuse, physical, sexual abuse, messing with your apparatus of desire. In a weird way, Kathleen is actually waiting that extra hour or two because that's the object of her desire, to be punished by his truancy. That's part of it's what she most fears. It's also part of what she wants, because that's why it's so nefarious. That's why child abuse is so nefarious. If you can't, I mean, what is it that Anne Enright says in The Gathering, right? It's not that the Haggertys didn't know what they wanted. It's that they didn't know how to want, right? They were not in power. They were not, equipped to know how to want, right? That's a profound state of being disarmed, to not know how to want.
Yeah, I mean, I think it also kind of inflects, interestingly, that you and I had a little sidebar in Margot the other day about how Mr. Gentleman seems to have some echoes of vampire tradition. To me, the last time I read it, he reminded me of Dracula. He's referred to as bloodless several times, and but now I'm sitting here wondering how that sort of vampire valence of Mr. Gentleman, I kind of want to ask you, what does it mean he feeds on?
Remember, Dracula never gets in the house until you open the door, right? Right. Yeah. The vampire is always a figure that you want, as well as a figure that you fear and loathe, right? Mina Harker commits sexual acts, right? And it's not as if Mina Harker went in there wanting to commit sexual acts. This is actually a perfect moment. I can't believe, I never thought of this before, Kate. But if you think about, remember we talked at the beginning about simulations of agency?
Yep.
When Mina Harker sucks Dracula, that's a simulation of her agency. He has orchestrated her to do what he has compelled her to do. That thing about the vampire as being, both seductive and coercive at the same time, and that's the true horror. Is that, and that's why you become a vampire, because he couldn't force you to become a vampire unless he's tapped into and messed with your desiring mechanism so that you turn into him, right? Yeah. Mimetic. Vampirism is mimetic in the same way that trauma can be mimetic.
Well, yes, and it also fits. It also fits with the enigmatic signifier always ringing twice, because that simulacrum of desire into which Kate does enter with Mr. Gentleman, and which he does in a most Dracula-like way, kind of, he scripts it, right? He scripts, he orchestrates or grooms, but it's really important that it's her father who sends him, or sends her to him to ask about, I forget if it's either about borrowing money or having more time to repay money, but it's one or the other. It's something to which the father, so
it's also the father that gets Mr. Gentleman to abandon her, at least according to Mr. Gentleman, right? At the end of the novel, it's like, your father says no.
Yeah, and so he is a direct overlay of the will of the father. Yeah. And, that gets almost identically reenacted in Down by the River, where Mary, who literally is raped by her father, here there's a kind of, there's a little bit of air between, the rapist father, the sort of symbolically rapist father, and the, literally, child, or what do you call that? When you have sex with somebody who's underage, statutorily rapist Mr. Gentleman, he's at least on the hook for that, or for setting that up. But in Down by the River, it comes together that the father sends her out to watch, and it's much more explicit, to have a mare bred by a stallion, and rapes her on the way home from that.
So we have a question that came in, and I'll just say one last thing to kind of close that. The other thing you're making me think about is it also, reading Mr. Gentleman as Dracula-like, also goes to your question of non-normativity, because his descriptions are always about, I mean, he never actually, well, he has the long, slender fingers and the long nails like Dracula, but in many ways, his representation is also feminized. So I think that his sexuality is questioned in that way. But Guy Biner has asked, just as
Our series editor.
Just as Irish literature, hi Guy, just as Irish literature has reached a maturity of dealing with these deep issues, are we now in danger of facing a new challenge? Not simple denial or suppression, but in the age of fake news, of cynical manipulation of abuse narratives, which ultimately serve to discredit critical apparatus, i.e. QAnon.
I say Margot goes.
Oh yeah.
Go, Margot.
I mean, the thing is, we've always been in danger of that, but social media is doing weird shit. And I've been thinking about QAnon, which is so overwhelming that, you know, it really, again, you know, I don't want to wind up dissociated again. But so I've been sort of thinking about it piece by piece. But yes, Guy, I think that's a great and perceptive question. But on one level, I want to say this is always, the enigmatic signifier has always been available for manipulation and to be coordinated in these ways. And if you look at any of the books, there's several different books that, you know, fall into American queer studies that deal with, you know, there's one called Moral Panics. There's one called Curiouser, that's a series of essays that deal a lot with the demonization of homosexuals. There's a lot of good work that's been done on the sort of displacement of, you know, accusations against various unpopular minorities. And I haven't seen stuff talking about the how rapidly and in what a smooth way once marriage rights were established and it was a lost cause for the right, that trans people just were the next target immediately. It was just like everything pivoted in this sort of amazingly graceful way to an obsession with bathrooms. Public bathrooms were now like what we needed to police in order to ensure against child molestation. And it is very clear to me that this is all a that this projection is always available, and that the enigmatic signifier can be solicited to create a real horror response that people are really powerless over, because our own enigmatic traumatic history, regardless of whether it entails sexual abuse or not, if it does not entail sexual abuse, still the enigmatic encounter is proximate enough to it and has a traumatic sexual charge to it, so that there's a defense against it ever being triggered. In a way, you know, like it's almost as though we walk around being like, that did not happen, you know, mommy did not feel like that, you know, she did not have those feelings about me. Because what is the enigmatic signifier? The enigmatic signifier is, you know, cryptic messages that are untranslated, that we hold, that are both, you know, jouissance and trauma, that bear within them both these things. They're fascinating, they're shameful, we can't acknowledge having received them. So anytime that button is pushed, you can get most people to, like, you know, have that kind of Oedipal, my eyes reaction, you know, because that's exactly what's, you know, being threatened. On the other hand, I think that this is the last thing I'll say. I think QAnon represents a new level of extreme danger. I was just working out with Kate and Joe exactly kind of where melancholia, you know, or sort of where melancholia rests relative to trauma. And, you know, I feel more comfortable certainly saying that where there is melancholia, there's been a trauma that is at stake, or that is being that's being held in abeyance. And if you think about what it is to be a QAnon participant, that is an extraordinary image of melancholic paralysis, right? That you are like sitting in front of a computer taking in one thing after another that you feel like you need, that's going to replace something, that's going to fill something, that's going to like take care of something that is broken, that is a problem, that has to be fixed, that has to be fixed, that has to be fixed. That is a melancholic state of paralysis, and it's coordinated and it's enormous, and it's very, very scary.
So Margot, we have about 5 minutes, I think, in the hour that we were allotting ourselves before we try to turn to if anyone has any questions. And so I do want to use what you were just saying about sort of the imbrication of eros and trauma to turn to The Gathering. And a subject that you brought up at the beginning of our conversation, which was the question of embodiment. And we had talked a little, Joe and I had talked, but I want both of you to engage this. We had talked about the fact that in the case of, it's my favorite passage in The Gathering is when she's talking about building her daughter. And she says, you know, she's eating all these plates of sausages and beans, and she wants to finish making her, for when she is fully made, she will be strong. And I read this as a very gentle, empowering kind of counter narrative to her trauma. You guys read it differently in the book. You read it as creepy, that moment, that the mother's relation to the child's body is creepy. So I know, Joe, you have some thoughts on this, but, you know, why don't I go to Joe first, and then Margot, you can follow up on
I want to say, first of all, it's not that passage in isolation
Sure.
that I find creepy. It is that passage in connection to the passages surrounding, first of all, Rowan at the wedding and her virtually oral consumption of Rowan at the wedding, and also her sense of her brother's body and her long-standing, which is something we probably didn't talk about, I don't think, long-standing eroticized investment in Liam's body that goes way, way back to the very beginning, and which she counterposes to her daughter's body at the last scene where you see Liam, and there's, you know, the sad person who's, you know, and she contrasts the kind of upright, healthy, vibrant body to his body, but his body as sexualized. And so it because there's reference to basically to Lamb in there, and so I think, you know, having read your more I would say more optimistic what I called your sunnier spin on it, I think that these are these are alternatives that go to the complexity of trauma logic, right? That I'm not sure at the end of the day that there needn't be an understanding that this sort of agential sort of assertion of bodily control, right, over the child and bodily abuse of the child are not, you know, two sides of a coin, one of which has a kinetonic and one has a very dystonic aspect. They both involve the child as something that you want to be a part of, and that you want to be in control of, you want to be kind of creative of. Yes, so the line between, you know, I'm going to be creative of the shot and I'm going to make, the line between that and the kind of grooming that goes on with Rowan, where she says, "Oh, I'm going to get him to kiss me, and I'll bet he'd ice cream." And I mean, there's all this kind of, you know, there's like a really kind of classically creepy stuff going on between Veronica and Rowan at that wedding. I think that I don't mean to, or I shouldn't, reduce what she does with her daughter to that, but neither can they be utterly dissevered either. Well, there's a communication there, just as there's a communication. One second, Margot. Just this. Just as there's a communication between the enigmatic signifier in what we might call its normative operation of subjectifying and sexualizing the subject, and the enigmatic signifier in its obviously pathological function within child sexual abuse. Okay.
So I have a follow for Margot based on that, but I would just say back, Joe. So it sounds kind of like this brings us back to that question of the sort of warping of their entry into the symbolic. So even something that's intended as a recuperative, subjectifying in a good way, a gentle move can be inflected, which is true of trauma, that it doesn't just kind of ever just go away, and that the workings of it can be quite insidious. So Margot, I guess
I desperately want to build on what Joe just said, because one thing that I said when we were talking over the weekend is the idea that it's clearly one of the important things that is happening here, and I think I think it had to happen, is that this takes away this kind of easy, critical Manichaean divide between abuse and what is not abusive, what is purely nurturant. Because, we're starting with Jean Laplanche saying, okay, so everybody's got an unconscious. And as we know, and as we, if we accept Freud at all, if we have not dismissed everything that Freud has claimed, then we know that that unconscious has in it that which is socially sanctioned, socially not okay. Either socially not okay just within our little family or within our life, but also more broadly things that are just instilled into us that are not part of us. So there are all these like split off parts of the self, these split off desires. And, so if we accept that, and then if we accept that Jean Laplanche says that a parent who carries this unconscious is in this intimate relationship in the care of their child, and that sometimes, things that are unacceptable are going to get triggered unconsciously because it's in the unconscious, because we're good, decent people, and we don't we don't join the NAMBLA, it's fish in a bucket to go after, NAMBLA, but, we don't join associations that argue for the okayness of having sex with children, because we accept that, sexualizing children is wrong and that is damaging. So we then don't do it, that we know of, but we have an unconscious. And so right away, we're already starting with the fundamental emergence of, of consciousness, of a conscious subject. At that moment that the conscious subject is seated with a message from the unconscious of the other that is a sexual message, So given that, we're on a spectrum. Now, I just want to say two things.
Just one thing. Remember, Veronica is the victim of child sexual abuse. Yeah. So it's not like she's just anyone on that spectrum. No. She's someone for whom all of that is more fraught and more and bubbling closer to the surface.
I would never.
I'm just saying.
But I want to observe, and it seems important that yes, she is clearly somewhere on that spectrum. Right. She is also clearly not Lamb Nugent.
No.
Right. No. And that's important, because I think one of the most destructive things about us getting anywhere with really almost any kind of abuse is that binary notion that that either, and especially because because different things can have very different effects on different people depending on the circumstances too, right? So something can be less antisocial or less deviant, or less ill-advised relative to a child and traumatize that child more, and something can be more ill-advised relative to a child and traumatize them less. So anyway, all of that is true. And then all I want to say is that one of the beautiful things about The Gathering is, to me, or one of the really smart, sneaky things about The Gathering, is that it's so hard to tell what's going on with Veronica's marriage in that way. That Veronica's marriage is so close to something that can pass for a normative heterosexual relationship, a normative heterosexual marriage. And, you know, especially because in her description of her husband as raping her, Tom rapes her, right? That's her experience. And yet, you know, reading it as a reader, looking for the place where Tom actually violates her agency knowingly, I don't think it's there. And that's really important. That's an achievement, actually, right? Because she has achieved a demonstration of something that is experienced abusively, and that is, you know, that does not cross the Manichaean threshold into, you know, intended abuse. And I think we need to look at those things. I think, you know, abuse is very complicated in that way. And then I just wanted to say that it works the other way in The Secret Scripture, which Joe and I have just finished writing on, where there is a father-daughter relationship that is also right on the brink of like, is this or is this not, you know, a sexually abusive relationship? And in The Secret Scripture, I think it serves Barry's purposes to bring it as close to the line as possible, and ultimately have it be a relationship that is not that. He wants us to be worried about, is this where the trauma is coming from? Is this who did it? And it's not, you know. But in the marriage, you know, I think that the point that Enright makes is how very, very close what we would see as a perfectly normal, healthy heterosexual marriage, how similar that is to a marriage that is founded on the basis of one person's extremely damaged desiring system.
Okay. So I do think we should make sure we get to some questions. No. I mean, I have one more question I want to ask you myself, but I'm going to restrain.
Let me just say one. Because one of the things Margot said, I think is really important, is at the center of our analysis of The Gathering, and that is the idea of a new epistemology of child sexual abuse, right? And you know, in which you do not make these juridical distinctions, and which participants and victims, that there is not just a spectrum but a kind of fluidity of transaction. Having said that, I want to dissociate myself from the idea that I ever, in reading The Gathering, ever thought that Veronica's marriage was anything like normative, anything like healthy, or, I mean, it's never confused by that at all. I think the moment at which she said to Tom, "You'd fuck anything," and how young would you fuck them now? You know, you could fuck them as young as 9. That's when they get their period, you know, when 9 was the age that Liam was at when Nugent violated him, indicates that, you know, something's going on in that marriage that I, at any rate, would not be able to incorporate.
Sign off on, yeah. Okay.
Go ahead, Kate. You're up.
Oh no, I mean, my upness is just to turn it over to anyone in the audience who might want to have a question, because I've taken plenty of your time and this has been delightful. But does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask of the authors via chat? Or else I offer the promise and threat that I'll ask one question. Spare yourself my voice. And any questions anyone has?
You're up.
I was going to say, otherwise I'm going to assume we've proceeded with dazzling clarity. You don't want it to go to our heads. All right, I'll ask one more question then, unless anything pops up. The one question I had was about the nature of narrative, given everything that you guys have said. And I do feel like you wonderfully brought this back around at the end to the question of the enigmatic signifier, Margot, with what you were saying. What do you make of the fact that that same process of assembling her daughter, which I think you can read both ways, Joe. I'm convinced that actually you can read it both ways because of the enigmatic signifier and because of the nature of trauma. What do you make of the fact that that narrative construction parallels the other narrative construction, which is her reassembly of Nugent? The other person she puts together piece by piece is Lamb Nugent, and that is not a very happy parallel. So do either of you want to comment on that narrative parallel in the text in light of the enigmatic signifier?
Well, I think in both cases you're dealing with something like scriptotherapy, right? In which the attempt to write it out is not an attempt to report it, right? But is an attempt to recreate it, right? And to recreate it in the terms that are most answerable to Veronica, right? What gets problematic is the extent to which, you know, the terms that are most answerable to Veronica are not necessarily the terms that are most therapeutic for Veronica, because trauma has this way of seeking its own replication. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that Enright basically has, you know, Veronica writing a story that seems to be coming to a happy closure with the production of a new generation and a new child and new reconciliation, only to find out that happened all, you know, months before she is in the middle of a total meltdown, a meltdown in which she's doing the writing. And so there's a kind of what do they call it in Peggy Sue Got Married, that movie by Coppola, a kind of burrito construction of time, where it's like turning over on itself, and that turning over of time on itself it involves the complexity of what we can do with narrative, right? Does narrative really allow the distance to rewrite the story in a way that is therapeutic, or in rewriting the story, will we also be inevitably replicating certain of our deepest challenges, difficulties, pathologies, etc.? I think anyway that Enright studiously avoids coming down on either side of that, which I think is the equivalent to what Margot said. We can't be juridical about, you know, people are either on this side of the abuse line or on that side of the abuse line. Similarly, I don't think we can be juridical about narrative being either on this side of the therapeutic line or on that side of the therapeutic line, because those two things are always cooperating, literally.
Margot, did you want to?
Yeah, actually, Mary Trotter asked a question that I'd love to have a little whack at. She asked about, you know, in a broad way, about how we see this work as, you know, kind of impacting or interacting with Irish studies, and then with trauma studies, which I will let Joe have. So, and another category that I've lost because my brain is a sieve. But what I would like to talk about is Irish studies, because I think that what to me feels like the most fun and exciting thing about having done this is it now, in the experience of writing this, I found myself much more in dialogue with a much broader team of participants who have all been in various ways doing what work they could that they had to hand to fight what Mairead Hogan, I think, who wrote Republic of Shame, describes as the shame industrial complex, you know, and the shame industrial complex in Ireland is just one example of, you know, what I think we could find in maybe every modern country, you know, that the question of what to do with excess children and excess people, excess bodies, all of that is a, you know, biopolitical question that has been being answered in terrible ways, you know, since modernity got underway, really. And anyway, so what I became aware of as I was doing this work was of the many different genres in which people have been attempting to do this work. And especially I became very aware of and appreciative of the ways the Irish media has had many people who have done a lot of work for a long time. It was really fun collecting, you know, cartoons from Irish cartoonists who had, you know, created these iconic images of the X case and of, you know, of, you know, various situations that, you know, to them. Anyway, so when I started talking to those people, I started to feel like, wow, you know, this is something, you know, that we're getting to like comment on and make more visible. And it also makes me think of just bringing to visibility is more what the work of scholarship, you know, it's one of the important things that scholarship is about. I think what it has allowed me to think about much more is the alliances that are possible between memoirists and journalists and visual artists and scholars and activists, and how many people obviously wear more than one of these hats, and educators and social workers, many different people. And that these, you know, Foucault talks about the sort of division of society into, you know, disciplines and knowledge into disciplinary knowledges and stuff as a bad thing, if I understand Foucault correctly. And what I feel like maybe we have the basis for here is to have some conversations that are considerably less restricted among people who what they share is a concern about, you know, the shame industrial complex and, you know, and what all of us have to contribute to the work of continuing to make it ethically impossible to continue to run a society along these lines.
I would say Margot left me trauma studies and
Sorry.
And no, that's fine. No. I'm not saying I'm going to speak to that. And literary studies. And so trauma studies, I just want to say, I think, I hope our contribution, and this comes out really in the opening section of the Gathering chapter, where we talk about all of the people who read the Gathering and read it in terms of trauma and done very good work reading it in terms of trauma. But I think our contribution is to specify, using Laplace and using the enigmatic signifier, what is specific about child sexual trauma, how it is a different, and Kate, you referred to it, I think, a warping of the entry into the symbolic order, which is different than Holocaust trauma or other kinds of trauma. That our readings deal with the specificity of that trauma and open up, I hope, a space within trauma studies for understanding child sexual trauma as not just a particularly deplorable or a particularly grim or a particularly awful form of trauma, all of which is true, but that it's got specific psychological and sociological contours as a result. So that would be what I would hope. As far as literary studies is concerned, I would hope that, and this goes back to what I hoped we would accomplish way back when we started, which was, what's a specifically literary response? And the way in which literature can basically speak to historical events and historical conditions in a non-testimonial framework, such that it allows people to reckon with evil, reckon with ill, reckon with pathology, reckon with everything that they don't want to reckon with their own implication in everything they don't want to reckon with, because they're reckoning with it on fictional terms, but at the same time reckoning with it much more intimately than, say, the Mother and Baby Holmes report allows them to reckon with it, because they're reckoning with it from the inside out. They're reckoning with it on the basis of what is true of every literary contract with a reader. When you read it, when you pick up a novel, you agree, I will identify with the process of identification. I will take up that process of identification, and I will find somewhere in this that I will identify with and will put my head in that space. And that identification, which something like the Mother and Baby Homes Report frankly discourages. I don't think it wants you to identify with anybody who suffered any of this, right? And certainly doesn't give you any opportunity to actually experience the texture of that suffering. That I think what we have, I hope, what we have done is suggest certain means whereby these great literary texts and I feel like we, the thing that we do best is just like show, hopefully analytically, how great these novels are. I mean, just how freaking great they are, right? How these literary texts manage to get people in this space and manage to do one other thing, which I told you I've been thinking about. Why do it get you to actually enjoy the experience enough to come back for more, right? That there is some element of aesthetic distance that is also the offering of aesthetic pleasure to line your experience and your identification with trauma. When I was reading Emma Donohue's The Pull of the Stars, a book not about child sexual trauma, but a book where there's more than enough trauma to go around, right? And I am on the verge of weeping, okay? And I'm thinking, why? Why do I like this? And there actually is this the trauma literature is a literary experience of Joey Solis. That is, it's as Samuel Beckett said, it's such pleasure that pleasure isn't even the word, and really isn't the word, but it's something, right? And I hope that analytically we make at least gesture toward making clear why one can get that kind of experience from these novels, that experience of literary Jewish.
I would like to propose that maybe what the novels have to offer is the opportunity to distinguish between the enigmatic signifier as it operates normatively versus the enigmatic signifier as it is, as it operates under conditions of great trauma, of really debilitating trauma.
Well,
yeah,
I'm going to pass this back to Joe Nugent just with...
Can I just want to say one more thing? Joe, if you want to read the book and you don't want to pay for it, you can, that's the book, but to get that, you're going to have to pay money. If you want to read the book and you don't want to pay for it, go to the Indiana University website, look up the title of the book. When you get the title of the book, go to links. Click links and click on the link that's below links, and what will appear magically is the book from beginning to end, there for your reading pleasure, free of charge. The University of Buffalo spent a lot of money to get us this free, to get us to have an open access text. So I feel responsibility, to sort of pass this along. They want you to read for free, so.
That's absolutely marvelous. Thank you so much, Joe. And really, it's wonderful to say thanks to everybody. It's really a pity to have to say goodbye to the end of this conversation. I was going to say that if the audience enjoyed this half as much as me, we were doing well. If the audience enjoyed this half as much as the panel, I think we were doing okay, because it is such a delight to see the energy and the pleasure and the joy that was buzzing around among you three as you dealt with this really difficult text. It was just absolutely wonderful, guys. Thank you so awfully much. Thank you so much. And there it is, as Joe said, absolutely free. Can I just say one thing before we go, please? And that's to remind those of you who are still out there that the Irish Influence continues this coming Friday, as always, 4:30 EST. This Friday, we're talking about Seamus Heaney, and it's going to be the company of the wonderful Geraldine Higgins for Emory University. I think I can perhaps put a link up there, indeed. No, that's just the name of the Irish Influence. Don't worry, we'll send you information and look forward to seeing you. And thank you, Kate. Thank you so much, Margot. Thank you, Joe. And thank you, audience. It's been really great. Really, really great.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.